The aroma of rosemary and garlic filled the air as I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing a special dinner for Emily and Jake's anniversary. I glanced at the clock. Only an hour until they would arrive. I could already hear the laughter and chatter that would soon fill the house, a symphony of love that I had always cherished. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, taking a moment to admire the table I had set. The soft glow of candles flickered, casting a warm light on the plates adorned with the finest china I owned. "Sarah, you've outdone yourself again." I could almost hear Mark's voice echoing in my mind. He would be proud, yet in the back of my thoughts, there was a lingering sense of loneliness, an ache I couldn't quite shake off. Mark was often away, lost in his business world, and while I tried to convince myself that it was okay, part of me longed for more connection, more warmth. As I stirred the creamy pasta sauce, I heard the front door open, followed by Emily's cheerful voice. "Mom, we're here." The sound of her laughter was like music to my ears, and I hurried to greet them. "Happy anniversary." I beamed, pulling Emily into a tight hug. Jake stood behind her, looking handsome and charming as always, his dark hair slightly tousled. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of pride. He was more than just my son-in-law. He was a part of our family, a friend. "Thanks, Sarah. This looks amazing," Jake said, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. He leaned in for a quick hug, and I caught a whiff of his cologne, fresh and invigorating. As we gathered around the dinner table, laughter flowed easily, and the atmosphere was rich with love. But I couldn't ignore the subtle distance between Emily and Jake. They exchanged smiles, but something was off, an unspoken tension that hung in the air like a heavy curtain. I watched them closely, unable to shake the feeling that beneath their laughter lay an undercurrent of unfulfilled expectations. "Mom, do you remember that trip we took to the beach when I was little?" Emily asked, her eyes glimmering with nostalgia. "Oh, how could I forget?" I laughed, recalling the chaotic drive, the sandcastles, and the ice cream spills. "You were such a little daredevil." As the evening wore on, I found myself washing dishes in the kitchen, stealing glances at Jake as he helped Emily with the leftover food. There was an ease to their movements, a familiarity that felt almost intimate. I felt a strange flutter in my chest, and I couldn't help but note how his laughter resonated in the room, brightening the space around him. "Hey, do you remember that time I tried to impress you by cooking dinner?" Jake asked, turning to me with a playful grin. "Let's just say it didn't turn out quite like this." I chuckled, recalling the disaster that had unfolded that night. "You nearly set the kitchen on fire, but you had the best intentions." He laughed, that easy, infectious laugh that seemed to draw me in. "Well, I've learned a thing or two since then, but I'll never forget your patience with me." For a moment, the world outside faded away. The warmth of his presence wrapped around me, and I felt a connection that sent a shiver down my spine. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. This was Jake, my daughter's husband. I shouldn't be feeling this way. Just then, Emily's voice broke through my thoughts. "Hey, you two, save some stories for later. We need to get this cleaned up so we can enjoy dessert." I quickly brushed off the lingering sensation, reminding myself of my loyalty to Emily. But as Jake's gaze lingered on me for just a moment longer, I couldn't help but feel that flicker of confusion within me. What was happening? After they left for the night, I stood alone in the living room, the remnants of the evening still echoing in my mind. I replayed our conversation, the way Jake had looked at me, the warmth of his smile, and the way my heart had raced. I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself. This was just a moment, I told myself, just a fleeting feeling that would pass. Yet, even as I locked the door and turned off the lights, I couldn't shake the tingling sensation of Jake's lingering gaze. What was I getting myself into? The days melted into weeks, each moment creeping by in a haze of confusion and unexpected longing. I found myself drifting into daydreams, often conjuring Jake's smile, his laughter, and those fleeting moments we had shared. I would be folding laundry, the warmth of the sun streaming through the window, when the memory of his voice would echo in my mind, drawing me into a vortex of unwelcome thoughts. I shook my head, dismissing them as innocent fantasies, but deep down, I felt a stirring I couldn't quite quell. One afternoon, while preparing dinner, a familiar sensation washed over me, the kind that felt like being wrapped in a warm blanket on a chilly evening. I was slicing vegetables when I caught sight of my reflection in the kitchen window. My heart raced as I thought of Jake. What was happening to me? I was a devoted wife and mother, yet here I was caught up in an infatuation that felt both exhilarating and utterly wrong. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emily's voice pulled me from my reverie. She had just returned from work, her hair slightly tousled, eyes filled with the stress of her day. "Nothing, honey, just lost in thought," I replied, trying to mask the turmoil swirling within me. "Are you sure? You've been acting a bit distracted lately." "I'm fine, really." I forced a smile, but I knew that beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. A few evenings later, I sat babysitting for Emily and Jake, the little one asleep upstairs. Jake had dropped by to check on us, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. He lingered in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, but I could sense his eyes on me. I turned to catch his gaze, and our eyes locked for a brief moment that sent a shiver down my spine. "Sarah, do you think it's okay for Emily to be working late so often?" he asked, breaking the charged silence. I swallowed hard, the question hanging heavy in the air. "I just want her to be happy in her career," I replied cautiously, unsure of where this conversation was leading. "Yeah, but sometimes I feel like she's missing the important stuff like family." He sighed, and I noticed the sincerity in his eyes, a vulnerability that resonated with my own feelings of isolation. "Jake, it's tough for her. She's ambitious," I said, my heart racing as I felt the weight of his gaze. "But family is important too." "Exactly." His voice was low, and I felt the air between us shift. "Sometimes I wish we could all find that balance." In that moment, I wanted to reach out, to bridge the chasm that seemed to grow between us. But just as I opened my mouth to speak, my phone buzzed, breaking the spell. It was a message from Emily. "Are you okay?" "I'm running late." I sighed, glancing at Jake, who looked momentarily lost in thought. "It's Emily. She'll be late," I said, trying to sound casual. But the disappointment in Jake's eyes didn't go unnoticed. "Guess it's just us, then." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. As the evening wore on, I found myself distracted, my thoughts drifting back to the flirty messages I had seen on Jake's phone weeks prior, the ones that had set my heart racing and my mind spiraling. I had brushed them off as harmless, but they hovered over us like a dark cloud, unacknowledged yet palpable. Later that night, as I tucked the baby into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tension between us was about to boil over. My heart raced at the thought of confronting Jake about those messages. Should I? Could I? It felt like a betrayal of both my daughter and my own feelings. Finally, I decided I had to speak with him. I sent him a quick message. "Can you come over for coffee tomorrow? I need to talk." My hands trembled as I pressed send, my heart racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. Would I confront him about the messages? Would I confess my own feelings? The uncertainty was both thrilling and terrifying, leaving me on the edge of decision. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was standing on the precipice of something monumental. The air felt electric, charged with possibilities, and I wondered what the next day would bring. As I stood in my kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee drowned out the chaos of my thoughts. I had invited Jake over to talk, but the butterflies in my stomach felt more like a swarm. The texts I had found on his phone were still burned into my mind, a series of flirtations that spiraled into a world I never wanted to enter. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves as I heard the door creak open. "Hey, Sarah," Jake said, his voice smooth yet tinged with an undertone of uncertainty. He stepped inside, his charming smile lighting up the room, but it felt different this time. Charged electric. "Thanks for coming," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. I poured him a cup of coffee, my hands shaking slightly, and handed it to him, our fingers brushing for a moment that sent a strange thrill through me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he took a sip. "You seem a bit tense." I felt the weight of his gaze, and for a moment, the words lodged in my throat. "We need to talk about the messages I found on your phone." His expression shifted, and the easygoing charm faded. "Sarah, Please just hear me out," I interrupted, my heart pounding. "You can't deny that they were inappropriate." I searched his face for a hint of guilt, but all I saw was confusion mixed with something deeper, an unspoken longing. "Look, I didn't mean for you to see those," he said, his voice softening. "They're not what you think. It's just, I've been feeling really out of place lately." "Out of place?" I echoed, my eyebrows knitting together. "Jake, you're married to my daughter. You should be focusing on her, not whatever this is." He leaned closer, the air between us thickening. "It's not that simple, Sarah. I can't help how I feel." His vulnerability was palpable, almost magnetic. "Feel?" I hissed, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I've felt an attraction to you for a while now. It's wrong, I know that, but I can't shake it off. You're so different from Emily." My breath hitched as his words hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. "Jake, this isn't right," I murmured, my mind racing with the implications. "You're my son-in-law." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't ignore this any longer." His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to crumble. Before I could process what was happening, Jake leaned in. "Sarah, And then it happened. His lips crashed against mine, a rush of warmth and electricity that sent shockwaves through my body. I froze for a moment, caught between the thrill of his kiss and the horror of my betrayal. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to stop this madness, but my body betrayed me, responding to him in a way I had never imagined possible. As quickly as it started, I pushed him away, my heart racing. "Well, what did we just do?" I gasped, my hands trembling. Jake looked just as shocked, his breathing heavy. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" I interrupted, feeling a mix of fear and confusion. "Didn't mean to kiss me? Or didn't mean to feel this way?" "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair, frustration coursing through him. "I just can't help it. You're so beautiful, so caring. It's hard to see you and not feel something." I stepped back, shaking my head as the reality of the situation sank in. "This is wrong, Jake. I can't do this. I can't betray Emily. She's my daughter." "I know," he said, pleading with his eyes. "But it feels like there's something between us that can't be ignored." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and I felt torn apart. The kiss lingered on my lips, a reminder of the chaos I had just unleashed. I glanced away, trying to regain my composure. "We have to stop this. We can't let it happen again." He nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope, maybe? Or desire? I couldn't tell, but it terrified me. I turned and walked to the window, staring out at the garden, the colors of the flowers contrasting sharply with the turmoil brewing inside me. "Sarah?" Jake's voice broke through my thoughts. I turned back to him, searching for the right words, but all I could find was a mixture of regret and longing. "You need to go," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Before this gets any more complicated." He hesitated, his expression pained, but finally nodded. "I'm sorry for everything." As he walked out, I felt a tidal wave of emotions crashing over me. Fear, guilt, desire, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I stood in my living room, the shadows deepening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The weight of my thoughts pressed heavily against my chest, a mixture of guilt and desire swirling within me. I could still feel the heat of Jake's lips on mine, the way his hands had cradled my face, igniting a wildfire of emotions I had long buried under the routine of my life. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the memory, but it clung to me like a stubborn fog. "Sarah, are you okay?" My best friend, Lisa, had come over to check on me, sensing something was amiss. She peered at me from across the room, concern etched on her face. "You've been a bit distant lately." I forced a smile, though it felt disingenuous. "Just tired, I guess. Work has been hectic." Lisa didn't buy it. "You can tell me anything. You know that. Is it about Jake?" Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if saying his name aloud would summon trouble. I hesitated, my heart racing. I don't know. Things have been complicated." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "We had a moment the other day. A kiss." Her eyes widened in shock. "A kiss? Sarah, you're married. What were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," I exclaimed, my voice rising. "It just happened. I was confused, and he said things that made me feel." I struggled to articulate the storm of feelings within me. Desired. Alive. "Sarah, you need to stay away from him. This isn't just about you anymore. Emily is your daughter, and Jake is her husband. Think about what you're risking." Lisa's tone was firm, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. She understood the gravity of the situation. I nodded slowly, the guilt crashing over me like a tidal wave. "I know, but it's not that simple. I feel so lonely, and Mark, he's hardly here. I just want to feel something again." "Feeling something isn't worth destroying your family over," Lisa said gently. "You need to talk to Mark. You need to figure out what's going on in your marriage before you get tangled up with Jake." As we sat there, the silence enveloping us, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa's words were true. But the allure of Jake was intoxicating, like a forbidden fruit I couldn't resist. My thoughts drifted to him, the way he smiled, how his laughter seemed to light up the room. Meanwhile, Jake was becoming increasingly distant with Emily, and I sensed the growing tension between them. I had seen it in the way he glanced at her with a mixture of frustration and longing, as if he were caught in a battle between duty and desire. What would happen if Emily found out? Later that evening, I heard a knock at the door, my heart racing. I opened it, and there stood Jake, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and desperation. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to close the door and walk away. But I stepped aside, letting him in. "What are you doing here?" I asked softly, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. "I needed to talk to you," he said, his eyes searching mine for understanding. "Things have been off between Emily and me. I can't stop thinking about you." The admission hung heavy in the air. "Jake, we can't do this," I whispered, though my heart raced at the thought of being near him again. "I know, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. I've never felt this way about anyone before," he confessed, stepping closer. "You have to believe me." Before I could respond, he reached for my hand, his touch igniting a spark that traveled up my arm. I feel like I'm losing everything, and I don't know how to fix it, he continued, his voice cracking. I just want to be honest with you. I swallowed hard, torn between the urge to pull away and the magnetic pull of his presence. Jake, we need to be careful. This isn't just about us anymore. But as he leaned in, the world around us faded away. Our lips met once more, a collision of emotions, passion, confusion, and an undeniable connection that I couldn't ignore. This kiss was different, more desperate, as if we both understood the gravity of what we were doing. When we finally pulled away, breathless and shaken, I could see the conflict in his eyes. What are we doing? I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know, but I can't stop thinking about you, he replied, his voice heavy with longing. In that moment, I knew we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I was terrified of what it meant for all of us. As I stood in the dim light of the living room, my heart raced with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. I glanced at Jake, who was pacing back and forth, his brow furrowed in frustration. The air between us felt charged, heavy with unsaid words. This can't be happening, I whispered to myself, wishing I could rewind the past few weeks, erasing every fleeting moment that had led us here. Sarah, please, Jake implored, his voice low but urgent. I know this is complicated, but I can't just walk away from you. He stepped closer, his eyes pleading, and for a moment, I felt that familiar pull toward him. But guilt clawed at my insides, reminding me of the consequences. Jake, we can't keep doing this. It's wrong. You're Emily's husband, I exclaimed, my voice cracking with the weight of my words. I turned away, unable to meet his gaze, ashamed of the feelings I had allowed to blossom in the darkness. Is it wrong to feel something real? He countered, frustration seeping into his tone. What we have is real, Sarah. I've never felt this way about anyone before. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. I wanted to believe him, to embrace the warmth of his words, but the reality was far more complicated. I can't do this to Emily. She deserves better, I replied, my heart pounding. The thought of my daughter trusting me, relying on me, made my stomach churn. We need to end this. It's not just about us anymore. Jake's expression shifted, the desperation in his eyes morphing into something more intense. What if I don't want to end it? What if I can't let you go? His words hung in the air, a challenge that sent shivers down my spine. I felt the warmth of his breath, the magnetic pull of his presence, and I fought against it, clenching my fists to steady myself. Jake, please, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I need you to understand. This is tearing me apart. I took a step back, shaking my head as if to dispel the emotions swirling within me. We can't keep pretending that this is okay. But just as I thought I had convinced him, he took another step closer, closing the distance between us. What if I can make you happy? He murmured, his voice laced with longing. What if we could find a way through this? Suddenly, the door burst open, and Mark walked in. My heart dropped into my stomach as I turned to see the shock etched on his face. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, his voice booming in the small space. The tension in the room shifted instantly, and I felt as if the air had been sucked out. Mark, wait. I started, but the look in his eyes silenced me. He was staring at Jake, his expression a mix of anger and betrayal. I can't believe this. You too. His voice dripped with disbelief. Mark, it's not what you think, Jake said quickly, his demeanor shifting from desperation to defense. Not what I think, Mark interrupted, his tone rising. You're kissing my wife. What the hell else could this be? My mind raced, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. Mark, please, I said, trying to regain control of the situation. It's complicated, but I can explain. I reached out to him, but he took a step back, his jaw clenched tight. Complicated? You're having an affair with my son-in-law. How is that complicated? He glared at Jake, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal cutting deep. I had never seen him so angry, so raw, and it made my heart ache. Jake opened his mouth to speak again, but I could see the panic in his eyes as he glanced between us. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said, his voice trembling slightly. It just happened. Save it, Mark growled, his fists tightening at his sides. I don't want to hear your excuses. In that moment, everything I had feared materialized before me. The love and trust that had once defined my life felt shattered, splintered by the choices we had made. I stood frozen, caught in a storm of emotions, knowing that whatever happened next would change our family forever. The air was thick with tension as Mark stood in the doorway, his eyes blazing with a mix of confusion and rage. I felt my heart race, and my stomach dropped as the reality of the situation sunk in. There we were, Jake and I, tangled in a moment that had spiraled out of control. And now we were exposed. Mark's voice broke through the silence, sharp and accusatory. Sarah, what the hell is going on here? His words felt like daggers, piercing the fragile bubble that had formed around us. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. All I could manage was a weak glance at Jake, whose expression mirrored my own horror. Mark, I finally managed to stammer, but my voice faltered as I saw the disbelief in his eyes. He stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. Is this what you've been hiding from me? He spat, his gaze darting between Jake and me. You've betrayed me, both of you. Mark, please. Jake interjected, his voice shaky but firm. It's not what it looks like. Really? Because it looks like you were about to kiss my wife. Mark's words echoed in the kitchen, the weight of them hanging heavily in the air. I felt a rush of shame wash over me, and I could see the hurt in Mark's eyes. I didn't mean to, I began, but again I was cut off. Didn't mean to what? To fall for my son-in-law? To ruin your marriage? Mark's voice broke, and for a moment I saw a flicker of vulnerability before it was replaced by anger. Please let me explain, Jake pleaded, stepping closer to Mark, who seemed ready to explode. This is complicated. Complicated. Mark laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the walls. You call this complicated? You've been sleeping with my wife's husband. Stop it, both of you. Emily's voice rang out, sharp and clear. She stepped into the room, her face pale but determined. We need to talk about this. I turned to her, shocked. Emily, you don't understand. Actually, I do, she interrupted, crossing her arms. I've known for a while now that something was off between you two. She looked at Jake, her expression shifting from betrayal to something more complex. I just didn't want to believe it. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, my heart racing. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought I could fix it, she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil. I thought it was just a phase, but now, her voice faltered, and I could see the tears welling in her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you, Mom, but I knew Jake was struggling with his feelings, and I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. Struggling with his feelings? Mark echoed, incredulous. That's what you call this? You're both sick. Mark, please, I begged, stepping toward him. This isn't just about us. We need to figure this out as a family. Family? He scoffed, shaking his head. What kind of family betrays each other like this? The room fell silent, the weight of our choices hanging heavy in the air. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the reality of our situation crashing over me like a tidal wave. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, my phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the tense silence. I glanced at the screen and froze. An unknown number flashed before my eyes, the message reading, "You don't know the whole truth about Jake yet." My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. What is it? Mark asked, his voice suddenly low and dangerous, as if sensing my unease. I hesitated, the weight of the message pressing down on me. It's a text, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. What does it say? Emily pressed, her curiosity piqued, but I could see the fear lurking in her eyes. Just, it's from someone I don't know, I replied, my mind racing with possibilities. They say I don't know the whole truth about Jake. Mark's expression shifted again, a mix of anger and concern flooding his features. What does that mean, Sarah? I don't know, I exclaimed, panic rising in my throat. I don't know what's happening anymore. The room was silent once more, filled with unspoken questions and a growing sense of dread. I could feel the tension crackling in the air, the uncertainty hanging over us like a storm cloud. As I looked at Jake and then at Mark and Emily, I realized that whatever secrets were hidden in Jake's past, they were about to unravel in ways we couldn't possibly anticipate.